Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Bobo Low. Today, I hope we can set the scene over the next hour and a half in Russia's always complicated relationship with the world. What we're going to do today is to address two broad questions. Really, how does Putin look at the world? And how does the world look at Putin? If you like, the yin and the yang of Russia and the world. Now, before we hear from our distinguished panelists, I wanted to lay out some questions that the panelists and hopefully you will also answer and address. The first question is, really, is there such a thing as an integrated Putin view of the world? Or are his actions really a series of tactical improvisations reflecting the influence of short-term domestic political and external imperatives? Now, if we accept, for the sake of argument, that there is a Putin worldview, then what are its defining features? Should one see it as an essentially static phenomenon that originated in his personal background and upbringing? Or is it something fluid that reflects the contradictory influence of different internal and external factors? Because the question I always have is, how do you explain the fluctuations in Russian foreign policy over the last 15 years? For example, initially pro-European, then transatlantic post 9/11, then the strong emphasis on multipolarity and Eurasianism from about 2004, and most recently a kind of intensified Sinocentrism, almost a love affair with Beijing, it seems. And then that leads to the question of how fixed is Putin's view of the international system? What are the prospects for change? Are there any prospects for change? And if there are prospects, then what might bring about this change? Domestic pressures in Russia, the continuing rise of China, maybe a return to self-confidence in Europe, perhaps a new leadership in Washington? I also want to know from our panelists and from you, how individual is Putin's worldview? Is it really sui generis? Or does it really reflect a broader consensus within the Russian political elite and indeed public? Can one speak of a silovik or a Chekist mentality, or are such notions overplayed? When we look at Putin according to the world, my question really is, has the West completely misjudged Putin, for better or for worse? Have we been deceiving ourselves about shared notions and shared norms and shared interests? Or is the problem the other way around? We've never given the guy a chance. We've never really given Russia an opportunity at serious and equitable engagement. What responsibility, if any, do Western governments and organizations bear for the emergence of an openly antagonistic Putin and Russia? Or is there nothing we could have done in the face of inevitable national and imperial revanchisme? I'd like to know how much differentiation there is in Western views of Putin, between, not just among Europeans, but between Europe and America. And what are the policy implications of this? Is it true that we basically agree that there is a problem? We agree on the nature of the problem, but we certainly don't agree on what to do about it. And then finally here, how significant are the differences between Western and non-Western views of Putin and Russia? And what do such differences mean for the future of the international order? And the question here I ask myself is it time to move away from the idea of a common Europeanness with Russia? Have we been distracted by this illusion? And maybe we should work more closely with countries, including China, that retain an interest in preserving the international system in some form. Anyway, to discuss these and other questions, we have a really distinguished panel of speakers. Immediately to my left, Andrei Illarionov was a presidential advisor to Putin, and now a senior director, a senior fellow at the Cato Institute. Natalia Gevorkyan, in a sense, bookends the beginning and the end of, well, perhaps the end of Putin, the future, the past and the future of Russia, working with Putin on, from the first person in 2000, and more recently with Mikhail Khodorkovsky, a prisoner of Putin. Michael McFaul was the American ambassador in Moscow, and many of us see him as the godfather of the US-Russia reset, but I don't know whether you necessarily want that title.
I was the father of the reset and the end of the reset.
Ah, okay. All right. And finally, Hiski Haukkala, my good friend, a special advisor at the Finnish Foreign Ministry, a great expert on Russia-EU relations. So, Andrei, you perhaps know President Putin better than any of us here. Does he have a world view? And if so, what is it?
All right. Thank you very much. It is very nice, again, to be here in Tallinn, and I would like to thank our Estonian host for creating a special, a very unique atmosphere that contributes a lot to a very frank, honest, and productive discussion. At the point of disclosure, I need to say, especially with your some kind of kind remarks, that what I'm going to say is based neither on classified information, confidential information, or an information that became known to me while I was working at the presidential administration back in Moscow. Everything is based on absolutely public information, and it can be checked easily. And I have a couple of slightly more points that I probably use them as the bullet points, and after that we'll have time we can discuss. First of all, it is really next to impossible to try to claim that we can know personality and just to some kind of to say that we know or anybody could know just the whole, but he has a particular view, and we would claim that we know that view. First of all, because of complexity of this issue. Second, because of evolution of this view over time. Third, because of the natural secretiveness of a person. Nevertheless, we try our best to understand whether such worldview exists, and my answer would be immediate: yes, it does exist, and it is rather clear and rather distinct, and which can try to some kind of put main configuration of this worldview. But first of all, I'd like to mention some very important element that is being used by Mr. Putin in his activities at international arena. It also to some extent applies to his domestic activities, but first of all to international arena. First of all, it's a very long-term planning. Those who say that anything like attack on Ukraine, Russian-Ukrainian war, Crimean occupation annexation is a result of improvisation or some kind of ad hoc decision because he has been upset by a removal of Yanukovych. It just cannot read what has been recommended this morning. We do not listen Mr. Putin carefully. Just if we would listen to him and we would read what he said and what he did over some substantial period of time, it would be no secret at all. When I studied the beginning of the preparation to the Russian-Georgian war, it took Mr. Putin 9 years for preparation, from autumn 1999 to attack in August year 2008. Actually, the war has started actually on April 20th, year 2008. The Russian-Ukrainian war was a very important element, as a first element. Occupation and annexation of Crimea is been in planning at least for 10 or 11 years. Depending, this is why I'm saying 10 or 11, depending on what particular date we would take at the beginning of the war. At the beginning of hybrid war or the beginning of conventional military operation. So depending on this, because the beginning of the hybrid war was July 27, year 2013. and the beginning of the conventional military operation is February 20th of year 2014. So all this preparation started in summer year 2003. And already in year 2004, it was very seriously planning for occupation and annexation of Crimea. And after that, it has been planned for year 2010, after that for year 2015, year 2020. But because of events that happened, so they decided to do it early. But the plan was existing much earlier. There are a number of decisions have been taken on this way. For example, the very decision to start war against Ukraine has been taken by Mr. Putin in June year 2013. The decision of Security Council of Russia to start the war has been officially approved on July 5th year 2013. On July 27th, this decision has been announced publicly by Mr. Putin in Kiev in the presence of many, many people. And we can look at this in just video when he announced it. And also some kind of the first hybrid war operation started the same day, in July 27th, year 2013. On November 9th, year 2013, he brought Yanukovych back in Russia to one of the military bases and told him directly, if you would sign association agreement with European Union, I will take Crimea and 8 regions of Ukraine at the same time. So that was a very open blackmail to Mr. Yanukovych, which he could not withstand and took the decision that he took. But once again, it's a long-term planning. It's a very serious preparation, taking into account all possible factors, political, economic, diplomatic, all others. Enormous complexity of addressing issues on this preparing of this operation. Consultations with experts. For example, occupation of Crimea has been discussed with a number of experts, not only military and security, but with economic experts. Also, that time on February 8th and February 9th, there was discussed the possibility of imposition of sanctions from the West on Russia. And economic experts, the cabinet, the economic part of the Russian cabinet, has said that, okay, we would stand sanctions, and they gave green light to military operations. It has been done on 8th and 9th of February of year 2014. Attention to details, personal involvement in designing, planning, executing operation, operative intervention in actions if situation changes, strategic patience, if it is necessary, he is able to wait for a very long time, the choice of right moment for hit, and very long-term horizon, which is certainly is not the case for his opponents or partners in the West, because they are limited by the democratic procedures. So, and in essence, he's a very able, whatever we can say, player, gamer or gambler, and he's able to use so many cards at the same moment that probably I cannot find anybody else in the modern world who could play all these cards at the same time. Economic, political, diplomatic, military, terrorist, and many, many others. Information, disinformation. Certainly we can talk about this, but it's probably to be more correctly to use with word information, not information or disinformation, but disinformation troops, disinformation army. It's not information that we used to think about. So what is the view, the general view for the world? I would say it's a double approach. One approach towards some kind of big boys in the international area. First of all, the United States, to some extent, European Union, or more correctly, Germany. Not so much respect to European Union, by some reason. So this is kind of request for equality. Equality in a very simple sense of the word. If the United States does something, it means Russia has a right to do exactly the same, or even more. So if United States is able to bomb Afghanistan, it immediately means that Russia has a right to bomb Georgia. If the United States or European Union do participate in recognition of Kosovo, according to this view, So that is why it's not a problem to suggest to recognize Abkhazia and South Ossetia, and so on and so on. So that is why it's a very mirror-type approach. If you do something, whatever considered to be possible for you. So it's exactly possible for me, for us, in our area of the world. And the second part of the approach, it's absolutely disregard, ignoring of sovereignty of smaller nations, weaker nations, especially nations that happen to be some kind of living on the border of Russia. In essence, the view can be described as the sphere of privileged interests that is a part of the foreign policy doctrine that has been announced by Mr. Medvedev in July 2008, which actually showed that there is no difference between Mr. Medvedev and Mr. Putin, as some people could claim. It's absolutely not. Medvedev plays the role of the good cop in the same team.
Andrei, the vision that you're describing here sounds, as someone was saying yesterday, very Hobbesian. Now, do you see that this double approach and his approach to Crimea, to Ukraine, to Georgia reflects, as I think John Kerry once said, a sort of a 19th century view of international relations, but yet taking place obviously in 21st century context, using 21st century tools as well as 19th century tools? Or do you see it as something slightly different? How does he conceive of things like international norms and international law?
So I would not agree that it's a 19th century approach. I think it is 1945 year approach. It is very clear, it's a Yalta-Potsdam approach. And if we just use the correct terminology, it's an attempt to restore the Yalta-Potsdam world that has been damaged. It has not been fully destroyed because we see some elements of Yalta-Potsdam world in the United Nations, in Security Council, permanent members with the voting rights and so on. But in some regards, the Yalta-Potsdam world some kind of ceased to exist. So that is why, generally, his idea is to restore this Yalta-Potsdam world with a very clear sphere of privileged interests belonging to Russia, to him, and he's ready to respect other sphere of privileged interests that he said United States could have. I would attract your attention to the speech that probably never mentioned yet here, but I think it's the most important speech compared to all other speeches that have been made, including Munich, Crimea, Novorossiya speech, and so on. This is a speech on October 24th, year 2014, that has been made in Sochi, and I call Sochi speech. Sometimes it has been called Valdai speech. This is the most detailed explanation of his view about the world, and very clear offer to Mr. Obama to divide this world. This is an offer to come back to Yalta, put the world in new situation. And if you look into this document, this is a very remarkable document because you could find historic analogus to this document. It is two letters that have been written, actually had been dictated on August 23rd and August 25th, 1939, by then Chancellor of the Third Reich, Adolf Hitler, to then Prime Minister of Britain, Neville Chamberlain. In those letters, Mr. Hitler just described the position as such. Okay, we do understand that probably we don't have all this, we're not happy with what British Empire is doing, but we respect British Empire and we respect that British Empire has particular sphere of interest. Okay, please respect our spheres of interest. Let's have a deal. This deal, exactly the offer of grand bargain, it's a suggestion that Mr. Putin is giving personally himself and all army of his propaganda people over the last several months just to United States, to Mr. Obama personally. Even the kind of some participants of demonstration about Krim Nash were carrying this same kind of placards, very nice with Roosevelt, Churchill, and Stalin sitting in Yalta with the slogan, Obama, Roosevelt, and Churchill were smarter. So that is by giving a very clear signal and some kind of sending this message what they would like to get from Mr. Obama. So that is why he's hoping that Mr. Obama and the United States would respond to his claims and sooner or later would come to this another Yalta.
Andrei, that leads to, if it is another Yalta, Yalta was 3, not 2. So is the future Yalta that Putin envisages Obama, or whoever succeeds Obama, Putin, and Xi Jinping? Where does China fit into this Yalta-Potsdam world?
At this moment, there is no China. That's just very clear. This is kind of the world for two.
Very interesting.
Because, by the way, if you do remember very well, on that August of 1939, Mr. Hitler has sent 2 messages to Mr. Chamberlain. But at the same time, on August 23rd, he sent his Minister of Foreign Affairs, Joachim Ribbentrop, to Moscow with a very similar message to Mr. Stalin. Okay, we have some disagreements, but we could have a very good deal. Let's divide Europe, but now not Western Europe, but Eastern Europe, Central Europe. And unlike Mr. Chamberlain, who did not respond to Mr. Hitler, as we know, Mr. Stalin responded, and they had a deal. And they had a deal all on fate of nations of Central and Eastern Europe. So that is why this is a kind of public diplomacy that Mr. Putin is doing towards Mr. Obama. That there is probably another element of hidden diplomacy towards another participant in these international relations.
Excellent. Natalia, I wanted to move to you. You've observed President Putin over a long period of time. Do you see him as having a kind of worldview that was rooted in his personal upbringing and his professional background? Or do you see this as a sort of something much more fluid and evolving or devolving?
Thank you, Bobo. First of all, I want also to thank you. I'm very grateful to the hosts of this conference for the possibility to be here. And this is my first time in Tallinn after that awful winter of 1991 when I was reporting from Vilnius and Riga and came for several days to Tallinn. So I'm here for the first time after the greatest geopolitical catastrophe. And it's very interesting. And contrary to Andrei, I should have said everything that I'll tell you was strictly confidential between me and Putin. Okay, I cannot say that because most of what I will tell you is published or was published. No, actually, what I was talking about was not published. It's just my observations, which I will share with you, and my impressions. Maybe they're right, maybe they're wrong. It's up to you. You can reread the book and make your own conclusions. So we were talking in 2000 for many hours. That's true. I say to myself, okay, 15 years is a long term, and a lot of things have changed. At the same time, I was witnessing this very particular and sensitive moment in Putin's life, that invisible border between being almost unknown, although already the prime minister, but almost unknown person, KGB guy of 48, to become a president of the country. And that was this moment when he was himself. When I say that he was himself, I mean that at that moment there were no pluses and minuses that come together with presidency. That I would say burdens of the presidency. But in the case of Putin, he didn't accept it like that. Interesting that at the end of our last talk, he said, when I have already started my duties as president in charge, it was a short term when Yeltsin resigned and Putin has not been elected so far, but he was in Kremlin. So when I have already started my duties as president in charge, I felt something like satisfaction. Maybe that's not the exact word, but still. That was a satisfaction from the possibility to take self-dependent decisions, from understanding that you have the last word, and so many things depend on you. And responsibility is also yours. Yes, this is a very pleasant feeling of responsibility. And to be frank, I was so much surprised because at that moment, there were blowing ups of the buildings in Moscow and Volgodonsk. It was a second Chechen war, which he started and took the whole responsibility for that. And it was so strange that the man was saying, it's a pleasure to me to be, to be the only one to take all the responsibilities and to take all the decisions. And then I thought that maybe the next book, if I write it, will be called The First and Only Person. And I thought it back in 2000. And now look at us, 15 years, I couldn't, in my worst dreams, I couldn't imagine that so many smart, professional, talented people will go on and on for 15 years discussing that quite ordinary man as I saw him then. So I was trying just to understand what were those basic things about Putin. So I think that his mentality, I don't think it's obvious, his mentality was formed mainly in 1970s. Maybe partly it started at the end of 1960s because he volunteered to KGB at the 9th form of the school, which means 1968. He volunteered to KGB. The same year, it was the Russian invasion to Czechoslovakia. And so, but mainly as a student and the start in KGB, it was 70s. What were the 70s in the USSR? So it was an Iron Curtain, obviously, but there were cliches and lies that a person of Putin's environment couldn't and wouldn't challenge and couldn't verify. For example, all the countries on the other side of the Iron War, Iron Curtain, is evil. The main enemy of the USSR is the United States. We are the strongest country, better military, competition between East and West. Then later, when he started in KGB, the agent of influence, hot spots, like in political meaning of the word, local conflict, which threatens to become global conflict. So he had it, as all this generation had, from the news, TV, party-controlled press, and later in every training that he had in KGB. And the fact that having this already as a young man, he went to KGB, which promoted those lies. I think that makes this basic thing about him, this mentality of the Cold War, of those lies which he absorbed without challenging them, because he came from the environment like, he came from non-intellectual family, although with basic education like school and St. Petersburg University. He was not, his environment was not that, the one that was interesting in reading Solzhenitsyn or underground press or reprinted editions of some prohibited books. He was not about that. Interesting that Khodorkovsky, for example, is more or less from the same environment, more or less from the same sort of family. And he never was interested in anything which was, like for me, I was a student in the 70s. It was obvious that there are books that you should have read, although risking, right? It was something totally different. They did not, they trusted the things which they couldn't verify. And they couldn't verify. They couldn't say, no, America is not maybe the main enemy. They couldn't say, well, maybe something good in the West. You couldn't go there, you couldn't verify that, you just take it as granted. At the same time, and it's interesting because, for example, he started downhill skis at the same student's years. I'm sorry, I have a virus, it's awful. Downhill skills were not popular in Russia. You couldn't find the skis, you couldn't find the boats, you couldn't find the equipment. It was impossible to do. It was a rather particular group of people, Tusovka, as we say, very close, who started that. Okay, He wanted, and he went with the car to the beach, to the Black Sea. Very unusual. Not many people had cars. This trip to the sea or the car, it's something which, it was a sort of image of bourgeois kind of life, which they maybe heard about but never had about. It is all that at the same time with all those cliches, which are unverified. And at the same time, they are trying to be fashionable in a way. Judo, the same, it was very popular. So that was the beginning or forming this very interesting sort of Soviet young bourgeoisie, which was different to nomenclatura. Nomenclatura didn't do that, didn't do this downhill skiing, you know? But contrary to the punk movement, for example, which started at the same time in the 70s in the West, and the punk movement was all about freedom of personality. This, what they were doing, was not about freedom of personality. More than that, Putin understood very well that if you integrate into the system, you have a possibility to buy the skis and the boots. That integrating into the system gives you bigger possibilities than any, you know, fight for freedom, which he didn't even think about.
Natalia, I wanted to come in at this point, and the kind of intellectual formation and worldview that you're talking about, it sounds that it's a strategically antagonistic view of the world, in the sense of the West is the enemy, the West is evil. How do you reconcile that with his approach since he's become president, with, in a sense, his pro-European phase in the early 2000s, his engagement with Bush post 9/11, the reset, all that? Is that just tactics? That's just, well, there's the bigger picture of strategic antagonism, but in order to sustain that, we need to be tactically and operationally flexible. How would you respond to that?
You know what? I think that we're complicating Putin, and he's much actually easier to understand. What he's doing, he's returning the world back to 20th century and to the rules of the game of the 20th century. We are living, and the West is living, and other countries are living in the 21st century, and even part of Russian people are living in the 21st century. He considers himself to be smarter, stronger, and more popular leader than any other Western leaders of G7. G7, I'm sorry. And he's sure that he has one advantage facing all these leaders. They all come at most for the first terms. He has come forever. And he is sure that he has come forever. This is what I didn't say, but I wanted to say. There were also lies in the Soviet Union that he could verify, like social economics is better than the Western one. That was verifiable, actually. Sooner or later. In the moment when he could see it with his own eyes, he had already all the cliches here. That's why we have such a strange country now. He likes Western lifestyle. With everything, you know, inside lifestyle. I'm sure he prefers market economy, but as Andrei formulated years back, very particular market for very particular group of people. But he likes it. So what we have in Russia is a mixture of the cliches of 70s, what we have in Putin, with the sort of thing, with the changes. I'll tell you, the best formula has given me the officers of KGB, whom I was interviewing before the elections, 1996, and they gave this formula for me, and it works up to now. I was asking all of them one and the same question: what do you want out of this life? What do you want? And they were saying, you know what? We want the power as we had it before 1991. But we want to buy vodka at any place and any time of day and night. This is what we have now.
So what he wants is what Andrei was talking about, Yalta Potsdam, but Western consumerism, souped up, and plus maybe selective engagement with the West, really, but purely on Russia's terms, of course. It's not about give and take. It's about actually taking and getting the West to acquiesce to what we want.
But I think that what he wants will differ from moment to moment.
Okay.
Because if the sanctions go on, for example, and this consumerism will narrow, he will say that he wants, that he will unite people around himself on this basis of contradict to the West in any possible way, to develop national economy, all that kind of things. We can't say today he will do that or he will decide like that, because he's very operational, He sees what's the situation and he moves on in this situation. But the last thing that I wanted to say,
Natalia, we'll bring it back to you.
Okay, no problem.
Mike, you're in a unique position of being able to answer both sides of the question. So I'd be very interested to learn how you...
I'm in a unique position to describe what the entire world thinks about Putin. Come on. Don't make me do that.
Well, no, you can certainly do the United States, though. And you, as U.S. ambassador in Moscow, you would have had many dealings, surely, with the Chinese, with European embassies, with many counterparts. So I still think, obviously, you'll be bringing a U.S. perspective, but we hope you'll also be able to share with us some of the thoughts about sort of how the wider world as well thinks about Putin.
So let me try. First of all, thank you for the invitation to be here. I've tried to get to this conference for several years. I've had to cancel many times, and it's great to finally be here. It is an incredible crowd of people, some very old friends and some new ones, and I want to congratulate everybody that's here for having established this tradition, this institution. Second, I'll get to your question, but to get to your question, we have to... The what is Putin question is first, right? Because different people interpret that in different ways. And I guess that will be my punchline, is there's not, in my view, consensus about Putin's worldview in this broader world. But I really, in front of this crowd, to speak for the entire world, I'll let other people talk for their countries and their individuals. But I want to get back to something that Andrei said, because, I met Putin in the spring of 1991. I've written a lot about him. Most of it he doesn't like, by the way. He's told me that personally. He doesn't like my view of his view. But I'm going to end up where Andrei is, and maybe that's all that really matters. Because Putin, when he was a child, when you were interviewing Putin when he was in the 60s versus Putin today, we can argue about whether there's change in continuity. I actually think there's more. It's a more complex story. Yeah. I don't think he's as planned as Andrei has described. And if you're interested, we could definitely get into a debate about that. But we're going to end up in the same place. So the debates about how he got there are actually kind of for academics. I don't see it changing. To your question, 2 or 3 back, right? Is there any way that'll change? Yeah. In my view, there's no way that'll change, and so the debate about how he got there is rather academic. But I am an academic, so I just want to say a couple things about that, because I've actually dealt with him, obviously, as a government official in rooms one-on-one, and I just want to give you some impressions, anecdotes of my impressions of the guy, what I thought before and what I think now. And the first thing I want to say is one can have multiple preferences that contradict each other, and it's still the same person. I think we as analysts, and Andrei's in a very different position, and other people in this room too, who have dealt with Putin as a government official, are in a different place. But as analysts, we tend to want to code people. And you're doing it right now, right? That's your job.
I apologize.
Coding him. Is he a realist? Is he is he this? Is he that? Is he this? Engagement as institutions. And actually, it was Senator Obama that said this one time to me when I was having an argument with him about whether he was a realist or a liberal in our coding in American. Does he care about democracy and those kind of things, or just interests? And he said, come on, man. We're all a little bit of all those things. And it's simplistic to say that you're one or the other.
Sure.
So Putin is exactly the same. Putin has this view from the past that I agree with my colleagues, right? Formation of his view about us, we're the enemy, zero sum. The CIA is incredibly powerful, by the way. I'll get to that in a minute.
Which Snowden proves him.
Sorry?
I said so Snowden proves to him. Yeah.
And I have somewhat
Okay,
different
I'm
view,
sorry.
but the CIA is really powerful, but not nearly as powerful as Mr. Putin thinks it is. I'll come back to that in a minute.
Yeah.
But he also he thinks about different strategies for achieving those long-term ends. So one strategy he thinks that we can all be bought. That's a view he has. I've heard him talk about it. We Westerners, for the right price, we will get entangled into his way of doing business, right? So therefore, that can lead to very contradictory strategies. So on the one hand, I remember a meeting I was in with him a couple of years ago where he very blatantly said, we don't understand the world. This was about the Middle East, right? We are undermining these regimes, and it's going to create all these kind of problems, and very confrontational point of view with us. 5 minutes later, he was talking about the Rosneft Exxon Mobil deal as the most important event in U.S.-Russian relations in the last 50 years. So why was he saying that? It's not because he believes in markets. I don't think he believes in markets at all today. It's because he saw that as a way to buy us off, to get us into his system, right? And both of those things can be true at the same time. What changed, and I kind of think of them as genes, right? They're latent genes, and then different context makes one worldview or the other one become more expansive, more pronounced. And for me, the two critical turning points, these are obvious, but I want to say them because they get forgotten.
Mike, can I just pick you up on that? Because you're talking about, in a sense, almost a bipolar view of the world, and yet he bangs on about multipolarity and polycentrism. Does he really fundamentally see the world in terms of the Russia-United States relationship, or is that just?
I know you want us to talk about China. I can tell you want us to talk about China. I know we were trying to get back to that, but I do agree with Andrei. For him, in the short term, he grossly does not understand China, in my view. He makes all kinds of assumptions about the long-term Chinese-Russian relationship that I think are incorrect. So we could come back to that if you want. By the way, I think the Chinese are pretty smart about that. They play that well. But for right now, it's not about China. It's about us. And I want to get to this last point, and I'll stop, which is that for Putin, the main goal, of course, is staying in power. Let's be clear about that. The foreign policy is derivative of that. It's not something separate over here. It's all about the same, that all together. So the most important event for this other piece of Putin's worldview that's become much more pronounced, and we see it very starkly today, was not NATO expansion, was not missile defense, was not something that we did. It's something actually that you did, Ilya. It's something that the Russian people did. And that's the protests in December 2011, where that happened. First of all, he was pissed. He was really pissed. I remember. He's like, I made you guys rich, and you turned on me. Well, actually, you personally, too. I meant to say not you personally, but actually, I didn't make you rich. But the second one was fear. The second one was paranoia. And if there's one thing that I left the government from that I did not know before, was not this guy with this master plan, these 15-year plans to invade Ukraine. I think the plans existed, but there are other factors that came in that had to be necessary. It was the paranoia, and that flipped him on against the West, right? But then he got frustrated. It didn't work. Look at the polls. Look at the polls before Ukraine. Yeah. He was hovering around 43, 45%. Yeah. All this stuff about McFaul fomenting revolution in Russia. Some people bought it, but a lot of people didn't. Yeah, and he was very frustrated by that. And therefore, when a new opportunity came along, the fall of the government, the fleeing of Yanukovych, that became another argument. Not about who's going to control Donbass. That is just that's a piece in the puzzle. It gave him an argument for legitimacy moving forward. And my view is he's all in now. He's all in. He is fighting Nazis and evil. Okay. Read what I agree with Andrei. People need to read what Mr. Putin says, because we actually let it be mediated through our diplomats and through our television. Read what he says. He's fighting Nazis and evil, and that's us, by the way. Principally, it's the United States. He wants to peel off some of you in that fight. Yeah. And here's the problem with that in terms of this engagement versus not. Before, you could kind of be in between, and you could do this strategy at this time, this strategy at this time. But if you're fighting Nazis and evil, you can't negotiate with Hitler and the devil. Yeah. You see, that's a problem. Therefore, he needs this kind of perpetual struggle, this perpetual, not war, not peace, but no settlement. And to get me to the last part about us, and I just want to speak about Americans. I want to generalize. But the tension I feel, and I want to emphasize, I live in the Silicon Valley, so I know that creates a bias as well. But I see we Americans, and I know there's some government officials here, so I want them to speak for themselves. And I'm not speaking on their behalf. But when I was in the government, we always felt like we were a bunch of engineers, right? Silicon Valley. Like, there's a problem, we need to fix it, right? There's a problem. There's the Middle East peace process. We need to fix it. There's Syria. We need to fix it. There's the Ukraine crisis. We need to fix it. We need to have a solution to the problem. Yeah. Putin's a priest. Putin is not an engineer. He doesn't need a fix to the problem. He actually needs the problem to be open for a long, long time. I think for the rest of his time in power. And that tension, that, let's just get him to another Minsk 3, 4, or 5, and then, we're going to solve the problem like engineers do. He doesn't have an interest in that, and that, I think, is the principal thing we don't understand about him.
Mike, you're talking about Putin's main objective is obviously to stay in power, to expand and consolidate power. Does he have a vision for Russia in the world, or is it all utterly subordinate to his own personal vision?
It's to, in his way of thinking. And again, I want to emphasize that this is not, in my view, it's not a static view. It's not a view that he learned when he was a 20-year-old kid in the KGB. Like, how could he have a guy like Andrei Illarionov in his Kremlin if he always thought the same way? No disrespect. You've heard a little bit about the way Andrei thinks. I'd be interested for Andrei to answer that question too. I actually think it's more evolutionary. I think it's changed. Okay. But now he thinks he's in a fight for the survival of Russia. He believes that we are out to destroy Russia. He believes that.
But is it pure defense, or is there an element of offense as well, in terms of Russia can be a great global power? So part of it is defending against the depredations of the West, but part of it is actually really reasserting Russia on the global stage. Or is it just defense?
I think the point about Yalta is interesting. I think it's fanciful. There's no, who is going to sit down with him at a table and divide the world up? That is, if that is true, then that's where he's, very delusional and does not understand, at least my country. I don't want to speak for other countries, but the piece I want to emphasize is there's no status quo policy left for him right now. It has to be continual. The second objective is, he needs Ukraine to fail, right? That's what Donbass is about. It's not about, or I actually think Crimea too, by the way. He needs to prove that his model is the correct one, and that the challenges to that, he needs them to fail. And without question, The most important challenge to him is an alternative model with respect to markets and democracy that could succeed. So but I see it in a very smallish way. I don't see it in this grand way of.
Sure.
But the last thing I would say, as part of that, he is now focused in a way he's never been in terms of dividing Europe, dividing the transatlantic community. I mean, I'm not an expert in that, but there's lots of people here that are. That is part of the preservation of Russia in the way he sees it today. There's no the difference between the Brezhnev era that we were talking about last night was Brezhnev signed Helsinki to consolidate and to affirm the status quo, to affirm the victories of World War II. In that way, it was a very status quo kind of moment. Putin is a revisionist.
Okay.
He needs to continue to revise the situation in order to keep in power.
Thank you. Hiski, I wanted to move to you for a European perspective. Of course, Finland is just one European country, so there's no single European perspective.
Sure.
I get that. But I was just wondering, actually, from your vantage point, how you saw European views of Putin evolving or actually devolving. That in a sense, part of the problem here is, for many people, a growing European indifference to Russia except as a threat.
No, thank you, Bobo, and thanks for the organizers of this amazing conference for giving me this opportunity to be on this amazing panel. Really, as a scholar, I've been following the development of EU's Russia policy for the past 15 years, and in that light, perhaps I would like to venture to make perhaps 2.5 points in the next couple of minutes. I think the starting point needs to be that I do not think we really have a fully unified view about Putin or his Russia, for that matter. For many reasons. I mean, there's a lot of internal variation, different national perspectives on Russia to begin with, which are natural and are a fact of life. But also in light of this challenge that Russia has sort of raised or put forward in front of us, I have serious doubts about, even if we have a sort of a modicum of common understanding about the current situation and the challenge, whether we actually have the perseverance and the ability to sustain this kind of a consensus and understanding when it comes to Russia. And I think the bottom line for me, and I'm going to be very blunt, is I think the ugly face of Russia, or rather the ugly face of Russian challenge that they have raised in front of us, I think is such that for many of us it's too difficult, too nasty to even to contemplate. And I think there's still a lot of people in Europe, perhaps elsewhere as well, who simply balk at the idea of the gravity of the situation and the longevity of this challenge, and they would rather wish it just went away.
Can you name names?
I most definitely will not name any names, but I leave it up to you. And part of these reasons is that, or the underlying reasons, is that there is just not a shared analysis of understandings about the gravity of the situations, nor about the stakes or the highness of the stakes when it comes to this situation. And this is already I think in the European Union, and this is of course a problem. More broadly, I would actually argue that I do not think that at any point we have truly gotten Putin's Russia right. And there are some good reasons and probably bad reasons for it. And one of the good reasons for this is probably that both Putin and Russia have actually been work in progress. And I think this is important. I mean, it has been a moving target, and at least, and I say this with a certain amount of caution because of the panel, I'm probably the only one who has never met the guy. But I actually think that it is perhaps too simplistic to argue that there have been this mission from the word go, and they were always trying to get to this point. I think on the contrary, I don't think Putin wanted this conflict. I don't think he is in a happy place right now. And this is something we have to keep in mind as well, that Putin and Russia are probably work in progress. And if you want to be an eternal optimist, which I try to be these days, this gives us a half a chance as well. Maybe this is not the last word from Russia, even if it is the last word from Putin for the time being. The other thing, of course, that we have been work in progress as well. I mean, this whole transatlantic community has been in flux, enlarging, changing, deepening, new missions, new ideas. The European Union has definitely been work in progress, and more recently, crisis in progress as well. And this plays into our sort of understandings when it comes to all of this. And also, through a feedback loop, has actually fed up some rather unfortunate understandings about us in Moscow that probably have affected their calculus of what they are now trying to do with Ukraine, writing us off and not taking us seriously at all. And probably to a certain degree we actually deserve some of this bad rep. But I think we should have been by now already to prove, at least to a certain extent, that we need and deserve to be taken more seriously than that. And this is part of the story as well.
Hiski, I just wanted to just pick up
I had
on
a wonderful point I just wanted to make.
No, you'll
Very
come.
important.
Please.
If I may. Because I think this is, especially after McFaul used the sort of the pejorative term academic, and this is really something I really want to make strongly here today, because as a scholar and as a sort of a policy planner, I really need to make this point here today, because the audience is the perfect mix of both. And I think what sort of really frustrates me is this perennial disconnect between these two worlds, which I think is a huge problem for all of us. And I think the way I look at our debates right now, especially with hindsight, is that there has been too much simplistic analysis and wishful thinking when it comes to Russia for the last 15 years in our policy debates. And when you look at the sort of our scholarly debates, they have been telling us for years that both Russia as well as the Western policies when it comes to Russia and the wider neighborhood have been traversing in the wrong direction. And it's not just me. I mean, when I look around, I see half a dozen, 10 plus better scholars than I am actually, who have been telling us this for years. And I think this is a problem, and we need to make these two worlds come together better. And both need to get up their acts together. I mean, communications for scholars is a non-existent skill, and they have to start communicating their findings a lot better. But also the policymakers need to start listening as well. And I think this is important. This is very important as well, especially in a world when our policymaking is compounded and made much more difficult by the process described by Mr. Sikorsky yesterday. I mean, the EU process of making policy is far, far from optimal. And I think this is something we need to get right, because just like James Sher said yesterday, I think the times we are living are dangerous. And I would add to that, they are also borderline scary. And I think what we need to do is get Putin and his Russia right, but I think we also desperately need to get our own policy right. And to get there, I think we need also to have a better understanding of both the history and the present of our things.
I'd certainly second that, but maybe the problem is not just the disconnect between scholars and policymakers, but actually the disconnect even within the policy world, that you can have Russia experts in foreign ministries and other ministries, but the ministers don't listen.
Yep.
So we have multiple disconnects. But I wanted to come back to the issue that you raised earlier, which was you spoke about a lack of awareness, a lack of sensibility in a way. But you then also spoke about, you sort of seem to suggest that some policymakers, they understand, they're aware of the problem of Russia, of the threat, but it's just become too hard. They're too scared. So that's not entirely the same thing. So, I mean, is it that they're unaware, but maybe they are aware now, or is it that they just think it's too hard, and oh gosh, we've got the Grexit crisis to work out, and we've got our own Eurozone problems with immigration and getting growth back, and that just, oh look, maybe if we just wish it, this whole problem of Ukraine, it's a far off place, let's not worry about it. Is it lack of awareness, or just we can't be bothered?
I just flew in from Kiev. It's just an hour away.
Yeah?
It's not that far away.
I don't think it's far away
It's
at
not
all.
that far
But
away at
no,
all.
but Mike, I mean, there are clearly
Palo Alto.
Yes, but there are clearly European countries that don't see it as an immediate problem.
I'm sorry, I didn't mean to
so
interrupt.
Sure.
I mean,
Sure, I think there are lots of things probably accounting for this. I mean, the agenda is heavy. I mean, we are still internally in a crisis. I don't think the European Union has the stomach for grand strategy or strategic thinking or these kind of things. It is its forte. The main part of its strength actually comes from not being a grand strategic actor and playing different games. But now we are faced with a grand strategic challenge, and then it becomes a problem. And Russia is using registers of force that are basically alien to the European Union. And they are using them precisely because they know that they are alien to the European Union, because that gives them the comparative advantage. And I'm not sort of advocating that we need to get serious and tough and sort of really a tit for tat sort of game necessarily.
I want to be clear, I am. I think that's exactly what's needed, but go ahead.
Yes, but I think we need to get serious and tough about this challenge and sort of make up our mind that this is something we need to take much more seriously than we are currently doing.
that's great. That's good. I want to open it out now. Because there's so much interest, I'm going to take it in fours. Philip Blond. By the way, can you introduce yourselves, please?
Thank you. Philip Blond from Res Publica. I'm very interested in the analysis because you all broadly agree. It all seems, I don't mean this pejoratively, but it seems to reduce just to power. He's simply about power, simply about the maintenance of power. And that may be true, but it seems that we're not explaining why he's popular. We're not understanding the recent development and whether Dugan is being moved out or where he is, but the development of a form of ideology, which, by the way, has huge resonances in Europe. One trend we can detect is the rise of popular authoritarianism, where people actually see great decadence in democratic forms, where they see the cultural identity we've shaped doesn't resonate with them. We find that in Ireland, in France, even in Sweden, with 15% now voting for a Nazi party. So the point I'm trying to say is Putin isn't simply about power. Hitler wasn't about power. Hitler was about ideology. Communism in its origin wasn't about power. It was about ideology. And whether Putin's evolved an ideology to justify his pursuit of power, which I doubt because that isn't how human life is, it's clear that an ideology has evolved that isn't particular to Russia, that has great resonance across Europe. But nobody's explained Putin as an ideology that he might possibly believe in. I read Putin's speeches and I read them as someone who believes what he's arguing. It's quite hard to write the speeches he writes that are quite moving, even somebody who's not a Russian, and to see the resonance of that with other speeches of other politicians I write, and the Russian support of far-right and extremist groups in Europe isn't just simply for power, it's because it resonates with the ideology. So I'd like more on that, please, rather than just, he's just simply about power.
Okay, thanks, Philip. Ed?
I just want to explore a bit more the anti-Westernism. It seems to me that the key development for Putin is that when he came in, the West was very strong, and now it's very weak. And you can explain a lot of his approach, which I agree is basically opportunistic. When he sees weakness, he advances. When he sees strength, which he doesn't see very often, he retreats. Because of the opportunities that we have presented to him. He's not winning because he's strong. Russia's a $2 trillion economy and 140 million people. The West is a $40 trillion economy and 800 million people. It's astonishing if you look at the relative, as the Marxists would say, correlation of forces that we're allowing ourselves to be jerked around by him. He sees an opportunity to create a sort of grey zone in what we used to call Eastern Europe. He's trying hard to preserve his business model against the attack by the EU. But fundamentally, he sees it as a chance of busting the West. And revisionism is absolutely right. He thinks that the rules were written at a time when Russia was weak, and they're very unfair, and they're not in Russia's interest. And now the people who wrote the rules are weak, and so he's got a chance of changing the rules. So if there's a question, would you agree?
Kadri.
Yeah. Thank you. Kadri Liik, ECFR. I was struck when I went to Moscow in April last year, a month after annexation of Crimea, and we had conversations with different analysts. Everyone who was mostly analyzing domestic policy said that what happened was domestically motivated. Putin was worried about his domestic power, and it was Bolotnaya behind all of it. And foreign policy analysts all said that it was motivated by Putin's understanding of international world, spheres of influence, etc. And I've been wondering about the balance ever since. I mean, I understand it can in many ways be also both. Obviously, Putin sees his power as a sort of existential thing for Russia. But still, I think these two motivations sort of imply different policy options for us. Because if his supreme concern is his own domestic power, then in theory at least, it should be possible for us via sanctions and all sorts of harassment to create a situation when foreign adventurism becomes a liability for him, when he sort of better be more modest and maintain some sort of economic status quo at home, but otherwise we would endanger. But if he thinks that we are out to attack Russia and bring his power down, attack Moscow, because occasionally I pick up things in the internet that show that he's actually preparing for defense of Moscow. On the same day he announced Crimea annexation, he also replaced the head of GUS, the department that is in charge of governmental bunkers in Moscow. And might have been a coincidence, but a telling one. So if he thinks that we want to conquer Moscow, I mean, I'm exaggerating, but then it's a different situation. Then it's very dangerous, prone to misunderstandings, and I think our policy options should be different too. So how do you see it? Where does the balance lie, and what's the optimal policy prescription?
Okay.
Yes, thank you so much. I'm Leila Alieva, originally from Azerbaijan, but right now I'm at Oxford, based in Oxford. First of all, thank you. Very interesting, very multifaceted. First of all, Putin behaves as many dictators. He's got interesting commonalities with some dictators, particularly post-Soviet dictators. They have many common features. And it's actually about my upcoming talk in Oxford next week very resonates what has been said here, and especially with McFaul's ideas. And the idea, my idea is also that they calculate very well the vulnerabilities of the West right now. And one of them is what you said, that they can be all bought off, more or less. The other thing is that he considers that inconsistency in application of values is one thing, and lack of toughness in promotion of the international norms and principles is also constituting the other vulnerability. And my question is, what do you think could have been done differently by the Western partners, and what should be done now in their policies in order to address this sort of perception and sort of maybe improve the situation?
I'll turn it over to the panel now. You don't have to answer all 4 questions each. So what I would suggest is pick something that is of particular interest to you and try and answer it. Andrei, you first.
About anti-Westernism, he does not have anti-Westernism. He has a different view about 2 parts of the West. Anglo-Saxon part of the world versus continental Europe. Anglo-Saxon part of the West plus Baltic countries plus so-called frontline states, they are enemies, they are opponents. It is impossible to have any compromise with them, so that is why they should be defeated. Continental Europe, and especially such countries like France, and especially Germany, is friends. They can be achieved compromise with them, and they could be even allies. And this is a very serious lesson that has been learned in the 2003 crisis around Iraq. So that is why he still believes that the compromise with Germany possible and eventually will be. About the correlation of forces, along with correlation of forces should be correlation of wills.
Yes.
If you have forces but you don't have will, you are going to be defeated. And it's just an old saying, this I'm kind of the lions, let crowd of lions shed led by a ship could be easily defeated by a crowd of ships led by lion. Okay, so just if you don't have will, and the West does not have will at the moment, so that's why you're losing, regardless how much resources you have. 10 times, 20 times more, doesn't matter. Those resources are not being used. Nobody gives an order. Role of ideology is very important, and this is just underestimated. The role of ideology is much more important than power of money or just power of power, interest to keep power. And it's not been paid any attention. Weakness of the West, especially it was very clear in the very different reaction that two different American presidents had towards aggressions of Putin in two countries, against Georgia and against Ukraine. Mr. Bush was able to stop Russian aggression in Georgia on August 11th, and Mr. Obama deliberately chose not to do it. If Mr. Obama would do it something similar that Mr. Bush did on August 11th, year 2008, so there would be no problem with Crimea, there would be no occupation, no annexation, definitely would be no Donbass story. Mr. Obama deliberately chose not to do it, not to even repeat what Bush did on August 11th. And instead of that, he gave a green light to Mr. Putin. And that is why he was very thankful and grateful. Okay, thank you very much. It's exactly what I'm looking, because Bush said on August 11th, he not only said something, he sent troops. He sent American troops toward the theater. He sent Navy. One of these destroyers was called McFaul. Yes, and another was just U.S. Air Forces to Romania and to Turkey. And it was immediately interpreted in the very right way in Moscow that U.S. is very serious. At the same time, on February 27th and February 28th, on the March 1st, year 2014, U.S. President said, okay, we're not going to use military. Okay. Mr. Putin, thank you very much. It's exactly what I'm looking for, and I'm moving forward.
Okay, Andrei, I'm going to switch it back to Mike immediately for a quick response.
Well, I actually want to talk about the other questions.
Well, you can.
But just briefly on this, because I think this is a problem that we're actually having this debate. This is exactly the debate that Putin wants us to have.
Yeah.
But just to be clear, how many people were put on the sanctions list by George W. Bush? How many? Zero. How many companies were sanctioned by George W. Bush? Zero. How many troops were sent to Georgia in 2008? Zero. What was the military assistance program to Georgia in 2008? Zero. So we just disagree about that.
Yeah, that's fine.
So let's just agree to disagree.
Here's a very important point. I just may say, sanctions did not work and do not work.
Okay, let's not get sidetracked here. Mike, can you try and respond to some of the other questions, please?
But the point about perceptions is the right one, okay?
Yeah.
My criticism of my former colleagues is that, if you think about the strategy, punish Putin, support Ukraine, strengthen NATO, you go through that, the information piece, the fourth one, I think is the weakest of all. Yeah. They're actually doing pretty well in all of that. But to your point, there's a sense of nobody really wants to do any of this, right? That's the point. Ronald Reagan, in response, I was just looking at a speech that he made after the crackdown in Solidarity. Actually, what they did, you can compare it to what the West did in terms of Ukraine. It wasn't more than that. But the way that Ronald Reagan talked about it, fundamentally different. And this, just to your point, I don't spend a lot of time in Europe, so I'm just going to defer to my colleague's point and not talk on behalf of Europe myself. I think that's the fundamental thing, and Putin picks up on that, and he's playing the long-term game that Andrei talked about, has a lot of patience, believes that fundamentally there's just this sense here, especially, and I like the distinction between continental Europe and the rest, with just patience, we'll be able to figure it out. We'll be able to work with these folks. And I wanted to get to your point, because I think it's a very important one. It would have been different had people not been involved in Putin's policies. And we talk about this in terms of counterfactuals as academics, but imagine that there was no Bolotnaya. And imagine that the deal that Yanukovych and Putin did for $15 billion just happened, and these crazy Ukrainians, Mustafa Naim and all his crazy friends, just accepted it. We would be in a very different place today. And I think that's important to understand in two respects. One is, this is not all planned. Andrei and I just disagree on that. If Yanukovych would have taken that deal, they would have signed up for the Eurasian Economic Union, and they would be marching along with that. But these kooky Ukrainians had a different idea, right? And Putin doesn't get that. He doesn't understand that people, he believes it's all controlled by elites and the CIA and the FSB. That's his view. Yeah. And because of that screwed up his strategy. Yeah. But the second point about that is to this mobilization strategy. It's real. I agree with Andrei. I agree with other people. It's an ideology, social conservatism, anti-Westernism. Even if he wants to court the French, he also doesn't. He wants to have this anti-liberal values thing internally. And that we'll see how it plays out. I don't believe 80% of Russians support him, but most certainly more than 50% do, and it's part of the way that, I don't see it as it's either ideology or power. I see these things as just kind of one part of one strategy.
Hiski, you wanted to come in on the European angle.
No, I wanted to get back to the question Katri Leek raised,
please.
If I may, because I agree with you, Katri, and it's an important thing that we need to actually keep in mind and take perhaps even more seriously than we are doing at the moment. The problem is not Russia's amazing strength. That's not the issue. I think the problem is Russia's weakness, and even the existential stakes of this crisis when it comes to Putin's Russia. And I think this is a part of that we need to take very seriously indeed. But this was Putin's choice. I mean, he did this himself. He used this rhetoric to mobilize Russia because he had egg on his face, basically. He dropped the ball on Ukraine and he needed to do something, and this is the path he chose. But the problem is that there is no viable exit strategy. There is no honorable exit for this gentleman and this country in this current situation. But the other problem is that because of the weakness, it cannot prevail either. It can lay a claim for a sphere of influence, but it cannot have it.
Yes.
Even if we give it, it cannot keep it. Because not for long, you would see these sort of centrifugal tendencies coming back into play again, and it would be the same story all over again. So I think this really is a genuine catch-22 situation, and there are no easy solutions. But unless we sort of accept this reality, I think we are just going to make a bigger mess with our sort of good intentional and meaning sort of policies and ideas about what to do about this.
Excellent. Natalia.
I would prefer to sit there and ask questions, to be frank. But what I think is that I'm living in Paris for 15 years now. So what I see from the Western side, that there is no strategy at all, European, united, by any country. I was talking to one of the highest officials in the Socialist Party and she told me half of the party is saying we have to deal with Putin. The other half of the party says we don't have to deal with Putin. We cannot deal with the Putin. So it's inside one party, in one country. So does Putin have strategy? This is another question. I think he does, and I absolutely agree with what Michael said, that for me, as I see it, everything that happens outside the country works on the inside politics. So my question was how he would keep this Ukrainian conflict up to 2018. Okay, I don't know. Up to 2016, because these are parliamentary elections. He will. I think he will easily keep it. Like, with Donetsk and all these territories, he will keep it. Then I think, okay, if the sanctions work, works like they do not work ideologically, but they do work economically somehow. So the situation worsens in economics. Then my question is, if the situation will go on worsening, will he do what Nazarbayev has done and move the elections to 2006 and start them earlier, the presidential, and connect them with parliamentary? I don't know what you think, Ilya. Because that will be easier for him if the economical situation worsens. Okay. So, I don't know, but I know that everything that happens outside the country, he uses very profitably inside the country. The question that I'm asked in the West, for example, by the journalists, tell us, if he moves to Kiev military, will anybody come against him? Will the West come against him if he moves to Kiev? And I don't have an answer. Do you?
Okay.
I do.
We'll leave that for the last round. I'm going to take. We started late, so I'm going to go an extra 5-10 minutes, if I may, because there is so much interest. I've only got time really for 5 people, so I'm going to kick off with Quentin Peel here.
Thanks, Bobo. Quentin Peel, Chatham House and the FT. I have 2 questions, really, one for Andrei and one for Natalia. Okay, Putin doesn't believe in and probably doesn't understand the market economy, but does he still think at all of economic fundamentals? When he started in office, he made a big point of pointing out the demographic disaster, the health disasters, and the real problems of Russia. Has he completely taken his eye off those things and is actually just looking for a distraction? Because that's the weakness that will surely come to haunt him, and the weakness indeed vis-a-vis China in the east and in Siberia. And Natalia, the other big mistake that I think Putin has made has been to completely screw up his relationship with Germany, and in particular his relationship with Angela Merkel. What is it about Putin and women? Every time he meets Angela Merkel, there's a sort of desire to humiliate her. And he totally misreads what is probably his single most important foreign policy relationship.
Agree. Yeah. Just behind Meri.
Thank you, Bobo. First, I'd like to thank Hiski, Haukkala for paying tribute to the work of academics. I think, yes, most of us here were not that wrong a few years ago about developments in Russia. I'd like also to thank you for giving some information and assessment of European policies, because we haven't heard much so far about Europe. And it seems to me that the divisions, Natasha, inside the Socialist Party of France are many more than the divisions amongst European governments when it comes to clear solidarity in terms of sanctions against Russia's policy in Crimea and in Donbass. So I'd like to say that at the end of the day, maybe Vladimir Putin is making more mistakes than we are. And I would like very much to have your opinion on that, on the rising costs for Russia of the aggressive policy in Ukraine, and how you see prospects for European and transatlantic attitudes to not only to Russia but also to Ukraine. And it's just had been raised by Quentin, but have not we underrated Russia's economic weakness? Certainly Putin seems to have underrated or made the wrong forecast about his economic capacity.
Okay, gentleman in the second row, just there.
Hi, I'm Jamie Kirchick from the Foreign Policy Initiative in Washington. I'm curious what the panel thinks about the role of history in Putin's mindset. May 9th is coming up, and there seems to be a lot of messaging coming from the Kremlin on this. I was at an event in Washington at the Kennan Center, the Kennan Institute, the Wilson Center earlier this week, which was co-sponsored by the Russian embassy. The Russian ambassador spoke, and there was lots of talk about how the Soviets won World War II, and we should really basically return to this alliance that we had in defeating fascism and Nazism. And these countries, these small Central and Eastern European countries are really kind of getting in the way, and which should be a very strong alliance between two great powers. And I'm curious as to what the panel thinks about that and what you see in the next couple of months. Thank you.
A gentleman just behind you across.
Good morning. I'm Jan Muromets from ICDS. Regarding the second part of the title of this panel, Putin according to the world, I would like to raise another, if you wish, a personal dimension or the perception of personality, what I have in mind. President Putin has staged several public relations or public affairs stunts, like leading the flock of wild geese, diving for an ancient Greek pottery in the Black Sea, and taming tigers. Whereas this may be beneficial from the viewpoint of creating the image of President as the father of fatherland or demigod, from the Western perspective, I think it rather reinforced the perception he's definitely not one of us. And my question is, to what extent this perception exists, and if yes, then to what extent it may have influenced policy making regarding how to respond to these steps.
And finally, Matt.
Thanks, Bobo. Matt Bryza, ICDS and the Atlantic Council. Wanted to maybe focus the end of the discussion a little bit on what is to be done and where do we want to go? How do we want to get there, right? We all seem to agree Putin's all in, whether, as Kadri suggested, it's for a frightening reason that he really feels vulnerable, or it's for more aggressive reasons, or it's more planned out, as Andrei was suggesting. He's all in. We think we've come a long way with sanctions, and that sanctions, I think, do have an impact. But as long as he believes in the utility of force as a bargaining tactic, as a very successful one, and we're not willing to put that on the table now, tactically, we're not all in. So especially for Mike, you made the point about being in favor of a tit-for-tat strategy. So how much tit-for-tat can there be if the most useful tactic he believes right now is the threats, these outrageous threats of military force?
Okay. I'm going to, final round here, just very quickly. Hiski, I'm going to bring it in with you.
Okay, thank you. Well, first of all, about the divisions in Europe, I mean, they exist and they are real and they are an issue, but they shouldn't be overplayed either. I mean, we also need to have historical perspective when it comes to these issues. Anyone who has read Cold War history knows that Europe always has had these divisions. They were always there, and they were, even during the most darkest times of the Cold War, they were managed because there was leadership. And I think this is sort of a crucial ingredient and factor that I think is probably increasingly getting into place. And this is sort of fingers crossed that the United States takes or carries its load when it comes to these issues, and perhaps in the European context, Germany, perhaps together with France, returns the favor. And if this should be in place, which probably will be in place, then I think we can expect to keep our sort of unity and our sanctions line intact and these kind of things going. So there will not be a serious unraveling of our policy line when it comes to this situation. That said, it probably won't be enough to get our policy right, because I think that requires a more ambitious understanding and perhaps a more sort of joined up approach throughout this sort of Euro-Atlantic area and region. What it would entail to get it right, to refer to Bryce's question about should we get in, and what that is all in, I think were the word you used, I'm not sure. I mean, I've always found intellectual sort of uncertainty sexy and appealing, but now that the stakes are getting so high, I find it less so. And my problem is really that before we get all in and do all kinds of these things, we should have a pretty good damn idea about the nature of stakes when it comes to Russia. What is actually the game that they are playing? Because if it is, like Kadri suggested, an existential game, and we are deterring a very weak adversary, that can be pretty dangerous indeed.
Yeah, that's excellent. Natalia.
Sure, okay. What's between Putin and women? You know what? I think that Putin feels himself like a missioner. This is the mission. I don't believe that any other leader in the world, in the Western world, sees himself like a missioner. So that is a problem in connections, you know. Merkel is a normal, pragmatic woman. She's appealing to the institutions. But the only institution in Russia is Putin, no more. That's the problem between West and East. There are no institutions in Russia except Putin. this is the fact. So it's not the problem. I don't think it's a problem between him and her. It's just a problem that she appeals to normal things, and he is the only thing which exists. And he behaves the way he behaves. I don't think there is anything else between them. To be frank.
So one question just on the Putin psychological, we put him on the table and we were analyzing him and flying with birds and diving and stuff like that. I would just emphasize two other things that I've noticed about him in my time in government and since, that are to be aware of as we get to Matt's question, which I want to end on, which is that he's been in power for 15 years. When he first came to power, Andrei was with him when he first came to power. My sense of him was, he was an accidental president. He was chosen by Yeltsin and his cronies. He wasn't chosen by the Russian people. He didn't really know much about flat taxes and things like that. He hired some good people to teach him about that, but he had to listen. Now he doesn't listen to anybody. I've seen him in rooms with very senior people from the Russian government and very senior people from the United States government. He thinks he knows everything. Number two, he sits out there by himself for most of his time. Like, he barely comes to work. I don't know if you know that, but he's just out there doing what he's doing. People drive out there to give him reports. And there are very few people that will challenge his assumptions about anything in Russia. And the ones that we all know and love, and we overemphasize them out of a spirit of hope, I think have a lot less influence with Mr. Putin than we want to believe. Yeah. Number three, he's become very religious in the later parts of his years. This is part of his ideology, and those are the people that he's hanging out with. That leads to less connectivity with us. And I think old leaders that are in power for a long time, that are thinking about their mission, I totally agree, create very dangerous kinds of interlocutors, right? Yeah. So that's why we need this grand strategy. So in my view, just to say what I said before, but I want to say it one last time. The strategy is really clear. We've all written it, we've done it. Punish Putin when he escalates. Don't let Ukraine fail. Strengthen NATO. And then I would say the piece we haven't engaged in, but this conference will get us farther in it, engage in this ideological struggle, which we just got out of practice, we don't think it's real, it is real. The problem is, on all of those fronts, the strategy is clear, but we don't actually execute it. Yeah. So if Putin escalates, we're supposed to respond. He took Debaltseve. What did we do? Nothing. Help Ukraine succeed. I don't know. I'm not an expert, but I think it's orders of magnitude more money is going into Greece than is into Ukraine. Exactly. That means that we're in terms of executing that piece, we're doing something. We got the IMF plan. It's better than nothing. But there's not the notion that we are fighting an existential struggle and therefore we have to help Ukraine succeed just doesn't feel like that. And so my plea would be to think about in grand strategic terms that we're not going to settle with Putin. We're not going to negotiate some agreement with him, that's going to settle things. This is going to be with us for a long time. And we need to think about it in those historical terms, if I may invoke history, not unlike the way it was after 1945.
Andrei, bring us out.
Okay, 6 short points.
Maybe two. Andrei, we're running over.
I'm trying to answer. Just please, I think it's important, especially last one. So,
why don't you start with that?
I would try in my way. Okay,
Andrei,
economics.
Andrei,
he does understand macroeconomics very well. That is why debt to GDP ratio, budget deficit as a percentage of GDP, pension obligations are much smaller than in Europe, and he proudly states all the time that is better in Russia than in other countries. Another problem with the nature of economics. And in nature of economics, he's not a socialist, and he does not see socialism as a credible idea, but instead of socialism, he likes Sicilism. It's just one word, but the difference is from Sicily, Italian island. So that is why, and he's not alone in thinking that it's a good idea. Mr. Berlusconi, Mr. Schroeder, Mr. Václav Klaus with him in this regard. And that is why he considers himself a very Western person. Only he likes very particular part of Western society and Western world, and this one. May 9th. May 9th is a very important date, and what is important, what he's going to do after that. After that, he's going to have another war. Just it should be very clear. There are many signs for that, but just look into one, military expenditure. The general military expenditure for previous 14 years was about 3% of GDP. Whole Ukrainian campaign was performed with 4% of GDP military expenditures. First 3 months of this year, it is 10% of GDP, 2.5 times higher. So this is not for Debaltseve, it is not for Ilovaisk, it is for much larger and much more serious campaign. Stay tuned. As for a reaction of US and Mr. Obama, what is important? Timing. You can do a lot of good things, but 1 year after, it is too late. What is necessary to do on February 27th and February 28th and so on. If you miss this point, after that, it is too late to use soft power. You're left only with hard power. And now I'd like to make it very clear, as much as I can make a clear statement, there is no non-military solution to this war. I can repeat it again. There is no non-military solution. And the other option is exactly what is grand bargain, is just to recognize, as it actually has been recognized, that Crimea is done. Nobody's talking about Crimea. There is no mentioning Crimea in Minsk and so on. Nobody's mentioning now Abkhazia and South Ossetia. It's a done deal. And it's exactly the part of grand bargain he's looking for. Is a tacit or open recognition that Crimea is done deal, and the United States will not be fighting for Crimea, Mike, as you mentioned just in Kiev a couple of days ago. That's exactly the point. And that is why, if it is open recognition that is done deal, it's exactly the grand bargain he's looking for. That is fine.
Final point.
Instead of grand bargain, I think what is necessary to do is grand strategy, which is absent, as many people already mentioned. And this grand strategy should include many elements and components, and we can discuss them. And certainly military component, it's absolutely clear, but it should have very clear target. What is this target? And I just would like to underscore, the long-term target is democratic Russia. It's not only to defend Ukraine. It's not only to provide assurance to Baltic countries. It's not only some kind of to restore the whatever international order of some kind of post-Second World War. The main point is to have democratic Russia. Because as long as Russia is not democratic, it will pose threats to immediate neighbors, international order.
That's great. Andrei, I'm not even going to try and summarize all of that very rich discussion. All I would ask is that we all join in to thank Andrei Illarionov, Natalia Gevorkyan, Mike McFaul, Hiski Haukkala.